Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. October 8, 2009 began like any other autumn day in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma. The air carried that crisp coolness that signals the changing of seasons, and the trees were beginning to transform into brilliant shades of orange and gold. For the Jamison family, Bobby, Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison, this Thursday morning held the promise of a new beginning. The Jamisons were searching for a fresh start. They had been looking at properties in the remote Sans Bois Mountains, a rugged and isolated area about 30 miles north of their home. Bobby and Sherilyn dreamed of leaving behind the complications of their current life, of building something new in the wilderness where they could live more simply, more peacefully. They loaded their white pickup truck that morning with supplies and their beloved dog Maisie, a small mixed breed who rarely left their side. Madison, blonde-haired and bright-eyed, climbed into the back seat with her favorite doll. The family was headed to view a 40-acre plot of land they had been considering purchasing. It was going to be a day trip, simple, straightforward, nothing unusual. But the Jamisons never came home. When family members couldn't reach Bobby or Sherilyn for several turned to alarm. On October 17, 2009, 9 days after the family had disappeared, a hunter discovered their abandoned pickup truck on a remote mountain road deep in the Sans Bois wilderness. The truck sat silent and still, parked on a dirt path surrounded by dense forest. The doors were unlocked. Inside, investigators found something that would chill them to their core. The truck appeared as if the family had simply vanished mid-activity. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the vehicle. Sherilyn's purse sat on the seat. Bobby's wallet was there. Their cell phones were in the truck. Most disturbingly, Maisie the dog was still inside, alive but severely malnourished, having survived for over a week without food or water. And there was something else. Something that made no logical sense. Cash. Lots of it. Inside the truck, investigators found $32,000 in cash, scattered beneath and between the seats, tucked into various compartments, as if it had been hastily hidden or frantically thrown about. But of Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison there was no trace. The peaceful family outing had transformed into one of Oklahoma's most baffling and disturbing missing persons cases, a mystery that would haunt investigators for years and leave a community searching desperately for answers that seemed to evaporate like morning mist in those dark mountains. To understand what happened to the Jamison family, we must first understand who they were, not as names in a case file, but as real people with hopes, struggles, dreams, and the kind of complicated lives that make us all beautifully, tragically human. Bobby Dale Jamison was 39 years old in October 2009. Those who knew him described a man of contradictions, simultaneously gentle and troubled, hard-working yet haunted by chronic pain. Bobby stood about 5'9", with a slender build that had grown thinner over the years due to ongoing health issues. He had light brown hair and a face that could shift from warm smiles to distant contemplation in moments. Bobby had worked as a mechanic and handyman for much of his adult life. He was skilled with his hands, capable of fixing almost anything mechanical. Friends and family members recalled how Bobby could diagnose an engine problem just by listening, how he could repair household items that others would have thrown away. There was a quiet pride in his work, a satisfaction in making broken things whole again. But Bobby carried burdens that weighed heavily on him. Years of physical labor had taken their toll on his back, and by 2009, he suffered from chronic PEF to affect his daily life. He had undergone back surgery, but the relief had been temporary. The pain remained, and with it came the need for medication, a reality that complicated Bobby's life in ways both physical and psychological. Those close to Bobby also knew he wrestled with depression. It wasn't something he advertised or discussed openly, but the weight of it was visible to those who loved him. Some days were better than others. Some days the pain, both physical and mental, made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. Yet despite these struggles, Bobby loved his family fiercely. His daughter Madison was the light of his life, and he doted on her with a tenderness that revealed the gentle soul beneath his troubled exterior. Sherilyn Lane Jamison was 40 years old, a woman whose life had been marked by both love and loss, strength and vulnerability. She was petite, standing about 5'5", with shoulder-length brown hair and eyes that could convey both warmth and worry. Those who knew Sherilyn described her as devoted to her faith, to her family, and to the idea that life could be better than it currently was. Sherilyn had a deep spiritual side. She was a Christian who took her faith seriously, often reading the Bible and seeking meaning in Scripture. Some who knew her said she could be intense about her beliefs, passionate in a way that sometimes made others uncomfortable. But this intensity came from a genuine place, a desire to find truth, to connect with something larger than herself, to make sense of a world that often felt confusing and hostile. Like Bobby, Sherilyn also dealt with mental health challenges. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition that caused significant mood fluctuations. When she was well, Sherilyn could be energetic and creative, full of plans and possibilities. But the disorder also brought dark periods, times when depression would settle over her like a heavy blanket, making everything feel impossible. Sherilyn's relationship with her own mother was strained, marked by conflict and misunderstanding. This added another layer of stress to her life, creating a sense of isolation that made her rely even more heavily on Bobby and focus even more intently on creating a stable, loving home for Madison. But above all else, Sherilyn was a mother, and in that role she found her deepest purpose. Madison Stormy Star Jamison was 6 years old, 6 years of blonde curls and gap-toothed smiles, 6 years of questions about why the sky is blue and where butterflies go in winter, 6 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees, and the kind of innocence that believes the world is fundamentally good, because the people who love you tell you so. Madison attended elementary school in Eufaula, where teachers described her as a sweet, quiet child who loved to draw. She carried a doll with her often, a constant companion in a life that sometimes felt uncertain. That doll would later be found in the abandoned truck, a silent witness to whatever had unfolded in those mountains. By all accounts, deeply, fiercely loved. Whatever struggles Bobby and Sherilyn faced, the pain, the mental health issues, they both agreed on one thing. Madison deserved the best life they could give her. She was the reason they were looking for land in the mountains, the reason they dreamed of a fresh start away from the complications that had accumulated in their current life. Madison did not deserve what happened in those woods. No 6-year-old does. The Jamisons were not a perfect family. They struggled with health issues, both physical and mental. They faced financial pressures. They had conflicts with extended family members. They were, in other words, deeply and recognizably human, flawed, struggling, but bound together by love and hope for something better. Their life in Eufaula, Oklahoma, was modest. They lived in a small home, and while they weren't wealthy, they managed. Bobby picked up work when his health allowed. Sherilyn focused on caring for Madison, managing the household. They attended church sometimes. They had friends and neighbors who cared about them, though the Jamisons could also be private, keeping their struggles largely to themselves. In the months before their disappearance, the family had become increasingly interested in finding a more remote place to live. They talked about buying land in the mountains, building a home away from town, living more simply. Whether this desire came from practical considerations, financial pressures, or a need to escape from something or someone remains unclear. But what is certain is that on October 8, 2009, this small family set out together with hope in their hearts. They believed they were taking steps toward a better future. Instead, they were driving toward a mystery that would haunt Oklahoma for years to come. In the weeks and months before the Jamisons disappeared, there were signs, subtle at first, then increasingly troubling, that something was wrong. Those close to the family noticed changes, strange behaviors, unexplained fears that seemed to grow like shadows creeping across a sunlit room. Sherilyn had begun to speak about disturbing events happening around their home. She told family members and friends that she believed their house was haunted. This wasn't mentioned casually or jokingly. Sherilyn was genuinely frightened. She described hearing strange noises at night, seeing shadows move in ways that didn't make sense, feeling a presence in their home that was malevolent and threatening. Some dismissed these claims as products of Sherilyn's mental health struggles, but others weren't so sure. Sherilyn insisted the experiences were real, that something dark had attached itself to their property or their family. She had even contacted a local pastor, asking him to come to the house to perform some kind of spiritual cleansing or blessing. In what would later become an eerie piece of evidence, Sherilyn had written a letter to the pastor shortly before the family's disappearance. In this letter, she described the spiritual oppression she felt in the home. She used language that suggested not just fear, but genuine terror of supernatural forces she believed were targeting her family. Bobby, too, seemed increasingly on edge. Friends noticed he had become more withdrawn, more suspicious. He talked about people being out to get him, though he was often vague about who these people were or what they wanted. Some attributed this to the effects of his pain medication, but others wondered if Bobby knew something he wasn't sharing, if there was a real, tangible threat the family was facing. There were also signs of financial stress, though the nature of this stress was complicated and contradictory. The family wasn't wealthy, yet they somehow had access to significant amounts of cash, including the $32,000 that would later be found in their truck. Where had this money come from? Why was it in cash rather than in a bank? And why would they leave it in their vehicle when they disappeared? Some family members later suggested that Bobby and Sherilyn had been involved in some kind of cash-based business or transaction, though what exactly this entailed remains murky. There were whispers about possible drug connections, not that the Jamisons were dealers, but perhaps that Bobby's pain medication needs had put them in contact with people operating outside the law. Others suggested the money might have come from a legal settlement or inheritance, though no documentation of such a windfall has ever been confirmed. What is known is that the Jamisons were planning to purchase property, 40 acres in the remote Sans Bois Mountains. They had been in contact with a local man who was helping them view parcels of land. This man, whose property was near the area where the Jamisons' truck would eventually be found, would later describe the family's visits as unremarkable. They seemed like any other family looking for rural property. Perhaps a bit quiet, perhaps a bit odd, but not alarming. Yet there was something else. Something that family members would only piece together after the disappearance in the days before they vanished. Bobby and Sherilyn had both made comments, suggesting they might not be coming back. Bobby's father would later recall a conversation where Bobby seemed to be saying goodbye, though at the time it hadn't registered as significant. Sherilyn had made similar remarks to acquaintances, cryptic statements about starting fresh or leaving everything behind. Were these simply expressions of their desire to move to the mountains and start a new life? Or did they know something was about to happen, that they were in danger, or planning something drastic? There were also the medications to consider. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were taking prescriptions for their various health issues, pain medications for Bobby, mood stabilizers for Sherilyn. How these medications interacted with each other, and with the stress the family was under, remains another piece of the puzzle. And then there were the photographs. On the day the Jamisons disappeared, someone, likely Sherilyn, had been taking pictures with a cell phone. These photos would later be recovered from the abandoned truck, and they would raise more questions than they answered. The images showed the family exploring the mountain property, Bobby standing near the truck, Madison playing in the woods, normal family moments captured digitally. But the metadata on these photos, combined with other evidence, would help investigators piece together a rough timeline of the family's last known hours. What those photos couldn't show, of course, was what happened next. They couldn't reveal whether the family left the truck willingly or under duress. They couldn't explain why they would abandon their vehicle, their dog, their money, and walk into wilderness from which they would never return. In those final weeks before October 8th, the Jamison family was under some kind of pressure. Whether that pressure was external, a threat from another person, or internal, psychological, spiritual, the result would be the same. A quiet morning drive into the mountains, and then silence. To understand what may have happened to the Jamison family, we must reconstruct their final known movements with as much detail as possible, walking through that October day as if we were there. Feeling the autumn chill, hearing the crunch of gravel under tires, watching as a normal family outing transformed into something terrifying. The morning began ordinarily enough in the Jamison home in Eufaula. Bobby and Sherilyn would have risen early, perhaps with the sunlight filtering through bedroom curtains, casting soft patterns on walls. Madison would have been roused for the day, probably still sleepy, clutching her doll as she would helped in clothes appropriate a day in the mountains, comfortable, warm enough for autumn weather. Breakfast might have been quick and simple. Toast, perhaps, or cereal. Coffee for the adults. The kind of rushed morning meal that happens when you have places to be and things to do. The family loaded their white 1999 GMC pickup truck. Bobby would have been methodical about it. He was a mechanic, someone who thought about equipment and preparation. They brought supplies, bottled water, some snacks, cameras to document the property they were viewing. Sherilyn's purse went into the cab. Bobby's wallet. Their cell phones charged and ready. And then there was the money. $32,000 in cash distributed throughout the vehicle. Some bills under the seats. Some tucked into the center console, some in the glove compartment. Was this intended as payment for the land? Was it hidden for safekeeping? The placement seemed almost random, as if the money had been hastily concealed or scattered in a moment of panic, though when that moment occurred remains unknown. Maisie, the family dog, hopped into the truck. She was a small dog, loyal and affectionate, and she would have been excited for the outing, tail wagging, nose pressed against the window as the landscape began to change. Madison settled into the back seat with her doll, probably looking out at the passing scenery with the kind of wonder that 6-year-olds bring to everything. The drive from Eufaula to the Sans Bois Mountains took roughly 45 minutes, following Highway 2 north through increasingly rural territory. As they drove, the landscape transformed. The relatively flat terrain around Eufaula gave way to rolling hills, then to the more dramatic elevations of the Sans Bois Range. The forests grew denser, the roads narrower, the signs of civilization fewer and farther between. This was remote country, beautiful in its wildness, but also isolated. The kind of place where you could go hours without seeing another soul, where cell phone service became spotty, where a wrong turn could leave you hopelessly lost among nearly identical dirt roads cutting through endless trees. Based on the location where their truck was eventually found, investigators believe the Jamisons arrived at the property area sometime late in the morning. The specific plot they were viewing was accessed via a rough dirt road that climbed up into the mountains, becoming increasingly primitive the farther you drove. The road was rutted and uneven, the kind of track that required careful navigation even in a truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into a greenish, shifting pattern. It was quiet here, the deep quiet of wilderness, broken only by bird calls and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Bobby would have driven slowly, carefully navigating the rough terrain. The truck bounced and swayed over the uneven ground. Eventually, they reached a point where Bobby decided to stop, either because the road became too rough to continue, or because they had reached the area they wanted to explore on foot. The truck was parked on the mountain road, facing uphill. Bobby turned off the engine. For a moment, there would have been only the ticking of the cooling engine, the small sounds of the forest around them, the rustle of wind in the high branches. They were alone in the wilderness. The family got out of the truck. The air would have been cool but pleasant, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. Madison might have run ahead slightly, excited to explore, while Bobby and Sherilyn gathered their things, cameras, water bottles, perhaps a map of the property boundaries. The photographs recovered from Sherilyn's cell phone show this part of their day. Bobby standing near the truck, looking at the forest around them. Madison in the background, her small form dwarfed by the tall trees. The images are casual, unremarkable, the kind of photos any family might take when viewing a potential property. But these photos would become crucial evidence. The metadata, the digital information embedded in each image, provided timestamps showing when each picture was taken. Combined with the truck's location and other evidence, these timestamps helped investigators understand the sequence of events. The family appears to have spent time walking around the area, looking at the land, perhaps imagining what their life might be like here. Did they discuss where they might build a house? Did Madison ask if they could get horses or chickens? Did Bobby point out good spots for a well or a garden? Did Sherilyn feel that sense of peace she was seeking, away from the haunted house and the pressures of their old life? We'll never know the content of those conversations, but the photos show they were there together, exploring their potential new home. Here is where the reconstruction becomes more difficult, where the solid ground of documented evidence gives way to speculation and mystery. At some point, investigators believe was early to mid-afternoon, something happened. Something that caused the Jamison family to leave their truck and venture farther into the wilderness. But what? The security video from a nearby location, we'll discuss this in more detail later, showed the family making strange, repeated trips between their truck and something out of frame, carrying small items back and forth. Their movements appeared odd, almost trance-like. Bobby and Sherilyn moved slowly, mechanically, without speaking to each other or to Madison. This was not the behavior of a family excitedly exploring a property. This was something else. Were they under the influence of drugs? Were they experiencing some kind of shared psychological break? Were they being directed by someone off camera? Someone threatening them? At some point after these strange trips back and forth, the family left the truck entirely and walked into the forest. They left behind everything: the money, their identification, their cell phones, their dog Madison's doll. They simply walked away from the vehicle and disappeared into the trees. Imagine for a moment what that walk might have been like. Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison, leaving the safety of their vehicle and heading into the dense forest of the Sands Boys Mountains. The afternoon sun would have been filtering through the tree canopy, creating patches of light and shadow that shifted and moved with the breeze. The forest floor in October would have been covered with fallen leaves, dry and crackling underfoot. Every step would have made noise: the snap of twigs, the rustle of disturbed vegetation. If they were trying to move quietly, it would have been nearly impossible. Did Madison ask where they were going? Did she hold her parents' hands, or did she struggle to keep up with their pace? Was she frightened, confused, or did she trust that Mommy and Daddy knew what they were doing? Did Bobby and Sherilyn exchange words as they walked? Did they have a destination in mind, or were they simply walking, compelled by some internal logic that made sense to them but to no one else? The terrain in this area is challenging. The Sands Boys Mountains are not high by mountain standards. Elevations range from 1,800 feet, but the landscape is rugged. Rocky outcroppings, steep slopes, dense undergrowth, and limited visibility through the thick forest make navigation difficult even for experienced hikers. And the Jamisons were not experienced hikers. Bobby was dealing with chronic back pain that made physical exertion difficult. Sherilyn was a small woman, not particularly strong or athletic. Madison was 6 years old, yet somehow they walked far enough into that wilderness that when their bodies were finally discovered years later, they would be found over 2 miles from where their truck had been abandoned. 2 miles of rough, challenging terrain. 2 miles deeper into the forest, farther from any road, any help, any chance of being found. What could possibly motivate a family to make such a journey? What force, internal or external, could be powerful enough to pull them away from safety and into the heart of the wilderness? The abandoned truck, a scene frozen in time. While the Jamisons walked into the forest, their truck sat silent on that mountain road. Inside, Maisie waited for her family to return. Hours passed. The afternoon stretched into evening. The temperature began to drop as the sun sank toward the horizon. Still, the family did not return. Night fell over the Sands Boys Mountains. The darkness in such remote areas is profound. No streetlights, no houses with welcoming windows, just the deep black of wilderness night broken only by starlight and perhaps a sliver of moon. Did Maisie whine and scratch at the windows? Did she sense that something terrible had happened to her family? Days passed. Maisie, trapped in the truck, began to suffer from dehydration and starvation. There was no food in the vehicle, no water bowl. The small dog's suffering would have been immense, though she somehow clung to life, waiting for a family that would never return. Back in Eufaula, family members began to worry. The Jamisons had said they were going to look at property, but they should have been back by evening on October 8th. When they didn't return that night, concern began to build. Phone calls went unanswered. The house sat empty. Bobby's father tried to reach his son repeatedly. No response. Sherilyn's mother, despite their strained relationship, also attempted contact. Nothing. By October 10th, the worry had transformed into real alarm. This wasn't like the Jamisons to simply disappear without telling anyone. Yes, they had talked about moving, about starting fresh, but to just vanish. Without taking their belongings, without making arrangements for their home. Family members contacted the Latimer County Sheriff's Office to report the Jamisons missing. The initial response was measured. Adults have the right to go where they please, after all, and sometimes people do simply leave their old lives behind. But the presence of 6-year-old Madison elevated the concern. A child couldn't consent to disappearing. Still, in those first days there was hope. Perhaps the truck had broken down in a remote area. Perhaps they were stranded somewhere without cell service, waiting for help. Perhaps Bobby's back had given out, and they were holed up somewhere, unable to call for assistance but fundamentally okay. The mountain property they had been viewing was vast and remote. Searching it systematically would require significant resources. And at this point, authorities didn't even know for certain that the Jamisons were in the mountains. They could be anywhere. 9 days after the Jamison family disappeared, a hunter made a discovery that would transform the case from a missing persons report into something far more ominous. The hunter was traversing a remote area of the Sans Bois Mountains when he spotted a white pickup truck parked on an isolated mountain road. The vehicle appeared abandoned. No one was visible inside or nearby. Something about the scene felt wrong, and the hunter decided to investigate. As he approached the truck, he noticed it was unlocked. Looking through the windows, he could see personal belongings inside, a purse, a wallet, and most disturbingly, a small dog that appeared to be barely alive. The hunter immediately contacted authorities. When deputies from the Latimer County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, they found a situation that defied easy explanation. The truck was a white 1999 GMC pickup, registered to Bobby Jamison. It was parked on a dirt road in an extremely remote area, accessible only via a series of increasingly rough mountain tracks. The truck was positioned facing uphill, as if it had been driven to this spot deliberately rather than abandoned in a panic. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing, they were never recovered, adding another layer of mystery to the case. Inside the cab, the scene was strange and unsettling. Sherilyn's purse was there, sitting on the seat as if she had just stepped away for a moment. Bobby's wallet was present, containing his identification and a small amount of cash. Both of their cell phones were in the vehicle. These were not items that people typically abandon willingly. Your ID, your money, your phone. These are the essentials you take with you wherever you go. Yet the Jamisons had left them all behind. But it was what else investigators found that truly shocked them. Scattered throughout the vehicle, investigators discovered approximately $32,000 in cash. The bills were in various denominations, tucked under seats, shoved into the center console, stuffed into the glove compartment, scattered on the floor. $32,000. Cleft in an unlocked vehicle in the middle of nowhere. Who leaves that kind of money behind? If the family had been planning to run away, to start fresh somewhere, wouldn't they take this cash with them? If they had been attacked or kidnapped, wouldn't the perpetrators have taken such a significant sum? The presence of the money made no sense under any scenario investigators could imagine. It suggested that whatever had happened to the Jamisons, it had not been a straightforward robbery or kidnapping, and it certainly hadn't been a planned disappearance. The family dog Maisie was still in the truck, barely alive after more than a week without food or water. She was emaciated, dehydrated, and in desperate condition. Deputies immediately got her medical attention, and remarkably, the small dog survived her ordeal. but Maisie couldn't tell them what she had witnessed. She couldn't explain where her family had gone or what had happened on that mountain road. Investigators conducted a thorough examination of the truck and the immediate area. They were looking for any signs of struggle, any evidence of foul play, any clues that might explain what had happened. There was no blood in the vehicle. No signs of a violent altercation. The truck itself was undamaged, no bullet holes, no smashed windows, no evidence of a collision or forced entry. On the ground around the truck, investigators found footprints. The area had been dry, so the tracks were not particularly clear, but they appeared to show that people had walked away from the vehicle and headed further up the mountain, deeper into the wilderness. There were no signs of additional vehicles having been in the area. No tire tracks other than those from the Jamison truck. This suggested that if someone else had been involved in the family's disappearance, they had either approached on foot or had been careful to park far enough away that their vehicle wouldn't leave evidence. The cell phones recovered from the truck provided crucial evidence. Sherilyn's phone contained photos taken on October 8th, documenting the family's visit to the property. These images showed Bobby standing near the truck looking around at the forested area, views of the surrounding landscape, Madison in various locations around the site, time stamps that helped establish when the family had been at this location. The final photo on Sherilyn's phone was taken at approximately 3:00 p.m. on October 8th. This gave investigators a rough timeline. The family had been alive and at this location as of mid-afternoon on the day they disappeared. Whatever had happened then occurred sometime after that final photograph was taken. But there was another piece of evidence that would prove to be even more unsettling than anything found in or around the truck. This evidence came from a security camera located on a property near where the Jamisons had been viewing land. A local man who owned property in the area had a surveillance camera set up to monitor his land and deter trespassers. By chance, this camera had captured footage of the Jamisons on October 8th. When investigators reviewed this footage, they witnessed something deeply strange. The video showed Bobby and Sherilyn making repeated trips between their truck and a spot just out of frame. They walked back and forth, carrying small items. Their movements were slow, almost mechanical. They didn't appear to be talking to each other. There was no visible interaction between them. What was most disturbing was the quality of their movements. They walked with a strange, stiff gait, moving in a way that seemed almost trance-like. They didn't look around them. They didn't seem to be alert or aware of their surroundings in a normal way. Some who viewed the footage described it as resembling people who were under the influence of drugs, specifically, people who were severely impaired but still able to move in a basic way. Others thought it looked like the behavior of people who were experiencing some kind of psychological break, acting on compulsions or delusions rather than rational thought. Still others found the footage simply inexplicable. The Jamisons looked wrong, moved wrong, behaved in a way that seemed fundamentally disconnected from normal human behavior. Madison appeared in some of the footage as well, standing near the truck, watching her parents' strange back and forth trips. Her body language suggested confusion or anxiety. She stood very still, not playing or exploring as a normal 6-year-old might. The security footage has never been released to the public in full, but descriptions from those who have seen it consistently emphasize its disturbing nature. This was not a family behaving normally. Something was very wrong. Once the truck was discovered on October 17th, authorities launched an immediate search of the surrounding area. Time was of the essence. The Jamisons had been missing for 9 days already. If they were injured somewhere in the wilderness, they might still be alive, clinging to survival. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office coordinated with other agencies to organize search teams. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement officers and professional search and rescue personnel. They spread out through the Sans Bois Mountains, calling the names of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison, hoping for any response. The terrain made searching incredibly difficult. The forest was dense, filled with undergrowth that limited visibility to just a few yards in many places. Rocky outcroppings and steep slopes made travel hazardous. There were countless ravines, hollows, caves, and other natural features where someone could become trapped or hidden. Searchers used tracking dogs, hoping the animals could pick up the scent of the missing family. The dogs showed interest in certain areas, following trails that led deeper into the mountains. But the trails always seemed to fade out or become confused, as if the scent had simply vanished. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the area, searching for any heat signatures that might indicate living people. But the mountain forest, filled with wildlife and insulated by thick tree cover, made such searches difficult. Any thermal signatures detected proved to be deer, bears, or other animals not humans. Days of intensive searching yielded nothing: no clothing, no personal items, no sign that the Jamisons had even been in these woods. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. As the physical search continued, investigators began the equally important work of building a complete picture of the Jamison family's life. Who were these people? What had been happening in their lives before they disappeared? Were there any enemies, any threats, any reason to believe this was anything other than a tragic accident? Detectives interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, and anyone who had recent contact with the Jamisons. They examined the family's home in Eufaula, looking for any evidence that might shed light on the disappearance. What they found was a family under considerable stress, but also a family that seemed to be looking forward to the future. There were no immediate signs of planning to flee or disappear. The house wasn't cleaned out. There were no letters or notes suggesting the family intended to vanish. Investigators learned about Bobby's history of chronic pain and his reliance on prescription medication. They obtained his medical records and spoke with his doctors. Bobby had been prescribed various pain medications over the years, including powerful opioids. He was supposed to be under medical supervision for these medications, but investigators discovered that Bobby's actual usage might not have perfectly aligned with his prescriptions. Friends suggested that Bobby sometimes took more than prescribed, trying to manage pain that wouldn't relent. Others hinted that Bobby might have sought pain medication from sources beyond his legal prescriptions, though this was never definitively proven. The pain medication angle became one line of investigation. Had Bobby been involved with drug dealers? Had he accumulated debts to dangerous people? Could the $32,000 in the truck have been related to drug transactions? Investigators also looked into Bobby's mental state in the weeks before the disappearance. His father described Bobby as having seemed depressed and withdrawn. There had been conversations that, in retrospect, seemed like Bobby was saying goodbye, though at the time they hadn't been alarming. Some wondered if Bobby had been suicidal. Could he have planned a murder-suicide, taking his family into the wilderness to die? But this theory struggled to explain the evidence. If Bobby had planned to kill himself and his family, why leave the truck? Why walk so far into the forest? And where was the weapon or method of death? Sherilyn's mental health history also became a focus of investigation. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had been on medication to manage it. Detectives spoke with her doctors and obtained records of her treatment. They learned about Sherilyn's religious intensity, her belief that their house was haunted, and her increasingly fearful state in the months before the disappearance. The letter Sherilyn had written to the pastor, describing spiritual oppression and asking for help, was retrieved and analyzed. Some investigators wondered if Sherilyn had been experiencing a psychotic episode. Bipolar disorder can, in severe cases, include psychotic features, hallucinations, delusions, paranoid beliefs. Could Sherilyn have believed that something or someone was pursuing the family? Could she have convinced Bobby that they needed to flee into the wilderness to escape a threat that existed only in her mind? This theory had some support. It could explain the strange behavior on the security video. People in the grip of shared psychosis can behave in bizarre, ritualistic ways that make sense to them but appear incomprehensible to observers. It could explain why the family would leave their truck and walk into dangerous terrain. If they believed they were fleeing something terrifying, logic and self-preservation might take a backseat to panic. But it struggled to explain other aspects of the case. How would this scenario account for what ultimately happened to the bodies? And while Sherilyn had mental health issues, There was no documented history of her experiencing psychotic episodes severe enough to cause this kind of behavior. Investigators took Sherilyn's claims about the haunted house seriously, not because they believed in supernatural activity, but because these claims might point to something real that Sherilyn had interpreted through a spiritual lens. They examined the Jamison home carefully. Could there have been something in the house causing the family to experience hallucinations or bizarre mental states? Carbon monoxide was considered. This invisible, odorless gas can cause confusion, paranoia, and hallucinations. But testing of the home's heating system and air quality revealed no issues. Some wondered about mold. Certain types of toxic mold can cause neurological symptoms. But again, no evidence of significant mold contamination was found. Was it possible that Sherilyn's haunting was actually the family being stalked or harassed by a real person? Could someone have been breaking into their home, moving things, making noises, creating the experience Sherilyn interpreted as supernatural? This was a more disturbing possibility, but one that investigators had to consider. It would mean that someone had been targeting the Jamison family, terrorizing them in their own home, possibly as a prelude to the violence that befell them in the mountains. The $32,000 in cash demanded explanation. Investigators conducted a thorough examination of the Jamison family's finances, looking for the source of this money. Bank records showed that the Jamisons were not wealthy. They had modest accounts with balances that fluctuated between a few hundred and a few $1,000s. There were no recent large deposits that could account for the cash. Had Bobby recently sold something valuable? Investigators could find no evidence of this. His truck was his main asset, and it had been found abandoned. The family didn't own other vehicles or property that could have been sold for such a sum. Had they received an inheritance? Again, no documentation supported this. Neither Bobby nor Sherilyn had recently lost a relative who might have left them money. The lack of a clear, legal source for the money inevitably led to speculation about illegal sources. The most common theory was that it was connected to drug activity, either Bobby selling pain medication, or the family being involved in some other way with the drug trade. But this theory had problems. If the Jamisons had been killed in a drug dispute, why leave the money? Drug dealers don't typically kill people and then fail to take $32,000 in cash. And if Bobby had been dealing drugs, where was the evidence? No drugs were found in the truck or the family home. No witnesses came forward describing Bobby as a dealer. Another theory suggested the money was intended as payment for the land they were viewing. But $32,000 in cash seemed like an odd way to conduct a legitimate real estate transaction. And the landowner they had been in contact with said no such arrangement had been discussed. The money remained a mystery, a large, inexplicable piece of evidence that didn't fit comfortably into any theory of the case. As investigators dug deeper, one name kept appearing in their notes: the man whose property the Jamisons had been viewing. Let's call him Mr. Beauchamp, not his real name, but a way to refer to him while respecting privacy. Beauchamp owned land in the Sans Bois Mountains and had been helping the Jamisons view parcels that were for sale. He had been in contact with the family in the days before their disappearance. He knew they were planning to come to the mountains on October 8th. Naturally, investigators wanted to speak with him. When interviewed, Mr. Beauchamp said that he had expected to meet with the Jamisons on October 8th, but they had never shown up at the agreed-upon meeting place. He claimed he had waited for them, then eventually given up and gone about his day. He said he had no idea what had happened to the family. Investigators pressed him. Had he seen the Jamisons at all that day? No, Mr. Beauchamp insisted. Had he driven by the area where their truck was found? No. Did he have any theory about what might have happened? No, detectives weren't entirely satisfied with Mr. Beauchamp's answers. His property was very close to where the truck had been discovered. The security camera that captured the strange footage of the Jamisons was on or near his land. It seemed unlikely that he would have no knowledge of a vehicle being parked there for over a week. But Mr. Beauchamp maintained his story. He was cooperative with the investigation, allowing searches of his property, providing alibis for his whereabouts on October 8th and the days following. Nothing concrete linked to the disappearance. Still, he remained a person of interest. In any mysterious disappearance, the last person known to have contact with the victims naturally draws scrutiny. And there was something about the situation that felt off to investigators, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. Given Bobby's pain medication use and the large amount of cash, investigators devoted significant effort to exploring potential drug connections. They spoke with known drug dealers in the area, listened to informants, and tried to determine if the Jamisons had any links to the illegal drug trade. One theory that gained some traction involved methamphetamine. The rural areas around Eufaula and the Sans Bois Mountains had problems with meth production and distribution. Small, isolated properties in the mountains were sometimes used as locations for meth labs, and the drug trade in the area could be violent. Had the Jamisons stumbled onto a meth lab while exploring their potential property, this would explain a violent reaction. People involved in illegal drug manufacturing are often paranoid and heavily armed. They might kill witnesses without hesitation. But again, where was the evidence? No meth lab was found in the area where the truck was discovered. No witnesses reported seeing suspicious activity. And if the Jamisons had been killed to silence them, why not take the $32,000? Why leave their bodies to be potentially discovered? One of the more unusual angles investigators had to explore involved Bobby's own father. Bobby and his father had a troubled relationship, marked by conflict and, according to some family members, actual threats. Bobby's father reportedly had made statements in the past that some interpreted as threatening, claims that he would kill Bobby, or that Bobby had better watch out. These statements were allegedly made during arguments and family disputes. Did Bobby's father have anything to do with the disappearance? Investigators looked into his whereabouts on October 8th and the days following. They examined his relationship with Bobby Sherling and Madison. Ultimately, nothing concrete emerged that would implicate Bobby's father in the disappearance. The threatening statements, when examined in context, seemed to be the kind of angry talk that sometimes happens in dysfunctional families, rather than genuine threats of violence. And there was no evidence placing him in the Sans Bois Mountains at the relevant time. But the investigation had to be thorough, and even uncomfortable family dynamics had to be examined and cleared. Sherilyn's mother, another strained relationship. Similarly, investigators had to look at Sherilyn's strained relationship with her own mother. The two women had significant conflicts, and there was tension in the extended family. Could this family conflict have somehow led to the disappearance? Again, investigators found no evidence to support this theory. Sherilyn's mother was cooperative with the investigation and appeared genuinely devastated by the loss of her daughter and granddaughter. As weeks turned into months, investigators found themselves with more questions than answers. The physical search of the mountains had been called off. It was simply too vast an area to search completely, and with winter approaching, the chances of finding the Jamisons alive had dropped to zero. Various theories circulated among investigators and the public. Theory N: murder by unknown third-party someone, either randomly or through some connection to the family, had killed the Jamisons and hidden their bodies in the vast wilderness. Theory 20: drug-related violence. The family had been killed due to some connection to illegal drugs, either Bobby's pain medication or other drug activity. Theory 30: mental health crisis, murder, suicide. Bobby or Sherilyn, experiencing a severe mental health crisis, had killed the family in a remote location. Theory 40: voluntary disappearance. The family had staged their disappearance to escape debts, threats, or their old life, though this struggled to explain the abandoned money and vehicle. Theory 50: accidental death. The family had become disoriented or injured while exploring, dying of exposure somewhere in the wilderness. Each theory had evidence that supported it and evidence that contradicted it. None provided a fully satisfying explanation for all the strange facts of the case. The investigation continued, but without new evidence, it began to stall. The Jamison family had vanished into the Sans Bois Mountains, leaving behind only questions and a white pickup truck filled with inexplicable details. And then the case went cold. The weeks following the discovery of the abandoned truck stretched into months, and the months accumulated into years. The Jamison family seemed to have been swallowed by the wilderness, leaving no trace beyond that eerie security footage and the truck filled with unexplained cash. For the investigators assigned to the case, the lack of progress was frustrating beyond measure. In most missing persons cases, there are leads to follow, witnesses to interview, evidence to analyze. But the Jamison case offered little to work with. The family had driven into the mountains and simply ceased to exist in any documented way. The file remained open, officially an active investigation, but in practice there was nowhere new to look. Detectives would periodically review the evidence, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previously missed. They fielded tips from the public, hundreds of them over the years, but none led anywhere concrete. Some tips were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful, people reporting having seen a family matching the Jamisons' description in distant states, sightings that never panned out. Others were cruel hoaxes, false confessions from attention seekers, or conspiracy theories so elaborate they bore no relationship to reality. The case became one of those mysteries that haunts a community. In Eufaula and the surrounding areas, people would discuss the Jamisons in hushed tones. What had happened to them? Were they murdered? Had they run away? Were their bodies lying somewhere in those vast mountains, waiting to be found? For the Jamison family's relatives, these years were a special kind of hell. The human mind craves closure, needs answers to function and move forward. Not knowing what happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and especially little Madison created a wound that couldn't heal. Bobby's father, despite his complicated relationship with his son, struggled with guilt and grief. Had he missed signs that Bobby was in danger? Could he have done something to prevent whatever happened? The what-ifs accumulated like stones, weighing him down. Sherilyn's mother experienced similar torment. Their relationship had been strained, marked by arguments and misunderstandings. Now she would never have the chance to repair that relationship, to tell her daughter she loved her one more time, to watch her granddaughter grow up. And Madison, sweet, innocent Madison, was the loss that hurt the community most deeply. She had been 6 years old, just beginning her life, full of potential and promise. Whatever had happened in those mountains, she had been caught up in adult circumstances beyond her control or understanding. The not knowing was perhaps worse than any definitive answer could have been. If the family had been confirmed dead, there could at least be funerals, a proper goodbye, the rituals that helped the living process grief. But with no bodies, no confirmation, there was only endless uncertainty. Some family members held on to hope that somehow, impossibly, the Jamisons were alive somewhere. Maybe they had amnesia, maybe they were being held captive, maybe they had chosen to disappear and would one day return. These hopes were irrational, grew more implausible with each passing year, but hope is often the last thing humans surrender. The Jamison case attracted significant media attention, particularly in Oklahoma but also nationally. The mysterious circumstances, the abandoned truck, the large sum of cash, the strange security footage, the complete disappearance of an entire family, made it irresistible to crime reporters and true crime enthusiasts. Television shows covering unsolved mysteries featured the case. News articles appeared on anniversaries of the disappearance. Online forums dedicated to unsolved cases buzzed with theories and speculation about what had happened. Some of this attention was helpful, keeping the case in the public eye and potentially encouraging someone with information to come forward. But some of it was intrusive and painful for the family, turning their tragedy into entertainment. Particularly disturbing were the conspiracy theories that began to circulate online. Some people claimed the Jamisons had been involved in satanic rituals, a theory based on virtually no evidence, but that gained traction in certain corners of the internet. Others insisted the family had been killed by a serial killer operating in rural Oklahoma, or that they had witnessed something connected to organized crime and been silenced. The security footage, in particular, became a subject of intense speculation. People who had never seen the actual footage, since it had never been publicly released, nonetheless offered detailed interpretations of what it showed. Some claimed the Jamisons had clearly been under the influence of drugs. Others insisted their behavior suggested mind control or demonic possession. The truth was far more mundane. The footage showed a family behaving strangely, in ways that suggested they were not in their normal state of mind. But without additional context, it was impossible to determine why they were acting that way. Although the official, organized searches ended in late 2009, some people never stopped looking for the Jamisons. Volunteers, particularly those with connections to the family, would periodically organize informal searches of the Sands Boys Mountains. These searchers faced enormous challenges. The area was vast, hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain. Even if you knew generally where to look, finding 3 bodies in such an expanse was like finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. The bodies could be in a ravine, covered by years of accumulated leaves. They could be in a cave. They could have been scattered by wildlife. And there was always the possibility that the bodies weren't in the mountains at all, that the family had somehow left the area before their deaths, taken somewhere else by persons unknown. Still, the volunteers persisted. On weekends, small groups would gather and comb through sections of the forest. They never found the Jamisons, but they did find reminders of just how dangerous and unforgiving the wilderness could be. The bones of deer and other animals, the rusted remains of old equipment, evidence of how quickly the forest reclaims what humans leave behind. Periodically over those 4 years, investigators received information that seemed promising. Someone would report having heard a rumor about a local criminal bragging about killing a family. Someone would claim to have seen the Jamisons on October 8th with another person. Someone would insist they knew where the bodies were buried. Each of these leads had to be investigated. Detectives would follow up, interview witnesses, sometimes organize targeted searches of specific areas. But every lead ultimately dissolved into nothing. The rumors were unsubstantiated. The sightings were misidentifications or inventions. The claims about knowing where bodies were buried came from unreliable sources seeking attention or reward money. One particularly cruel false lead came in 2011 when a person contacted authorities claiming to have information about the Jamisons' fate in exchange for money. Investigators, desperate for any break in the case, engaged with this person, only to eventually determine that they knew nothing and were simply trying to extract cash from the police department by exploiting a tragedy. As the years passed without resolution, certain questions continued to nag at investigators and anyone who studied the case. The money: why was $32,000 left in the truck? This question never received a satisfactory answer. Every theory of the case struggled to explain this detail. If the family was killed, why didn't the killer take the money? If they died accidentally, the money's presence was coincidental but still unexplained. Where had it come from? And why was it in the vehicle in cash? The dog Maisie had survived in the truck for over a week and barely clinging to life. This suggested that whatever happened to the family happened relatively soon after they parked the truck. If they had died of exposure after days of wandering, Maisie would have died too. The timeline suggested something had happened to the Jamisons within hours of their arrival at the property, leaving the dog trapped but alive. The security footage, the strange behavior captured on video, continued to perplex everyone who viewed it. What could explain the mechanical, trance-like movements? Drugs seemed possible, but no drugs were found in the truck or the family's systems. A shared psychotic episode, possible but unprecedented, something else entirely. But what? The lack of evidence. How could 3 people simply vanish without leaving more traces? Even in vast wilderness, bodies leave evidence. Clothing, bones, personal items, something usually turns up. But from the Jamisons, there was nothing. It was as if they had been erased from existence. Each October 8th brought renewed attention to the case. On the first anniversary, local news stations ran stories recapping the mystery. Family members gave tearful interviews, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. By the second anniversary, the coverage was less extensive. The case was becoming old news, replaced by fresher tragedies and more recent mysteries. By the third anniversary, the media coverage was minimal, a brief mention, a reminder that the case remained unsolved, an appeal for information that generated little response. The public's attention span is limited. New tragedies compete for the spotlight. The Jamison family was fading from collective memory, becoming just another cold case in a system overflowing with them. But the investigators who had worked the case never forgot. Neither did the family members who continued to grieve, and neither did the people of Eufaula and Latimer County, who felt the weight of this unsolved mystery in their community. Without new evidence, the theories about what happened to the Jamisons began to calcify into opposing camps. The murder theory. This camp believed the family had been killed by someone, either a stranger or someone they knew. Supporters of this theory pointed to the remoteness of the location, an ideal place to commit murder away from witnesses. They noted that the family had left behind money and possessions, suggesting they hadn't left voluntarily. The strange behavior on the security footage could be explained if someone was directing them at gunpoint, forcing them to do things that appeared bizarre to observers. The mental health theory. This camp believed that Bobby or Sherilyn, or possibly both, had experienced a severe mental health crisis that led to the family's death. The haunted house claims, the paranoia, the medications they were taking, all pointed to people under significant psychological stress. Perhaps one parent had snapped, killing the family in a murder-suicide. Or perhaps both parents had fallen into a shared delusion, wandering into the wilderness in a dissociative state. The accident theory. This camp believed the family had simply gotten lost or injured while exploring the property, dying of exposure in the wilderness. While this was the most innocent explanation, it struggled to explain some of the evidence, particularly the $32,000 in the strange security footage. Each camp had its passionate advocates, and online forums dedicated to the case often erupted into heated debates between people championing different theories. But without new evidence, these debates were ultimately futile. Opinions based on incomplete information, speculation masquerading as certainty. By 2012, the Latimer County Sheriff's Office had to face reality without a major break. This case was unlikely to be solved. The active investigation was scaled back. Detectives who had been working the case full-time moved on to other responsibilities, though they remained ready to respond if new information emerged. The case file was maintained meticulously. All evidence was preserved. The digital files, including the security footage and cell phone photos, were backed up and stored safely. If the bodies were ever found, if a witness ever came forward, if some piece of evidence ever surfaced, the investigation could immediately resume. But as 2013 began, the Jamison case had effectively gone cold. 4 years had passed since Bobby Sherilyn and Madison had driven into the Sands Boys Mountains. The trail, never warm to begin with, had gone ice cold. And then, in November 2013, hunters made a discovery that would reignite everything. The autumn of 2013 was unusually dry in southeastern Oklahoma. The forests were carpeted with fallen leaves, creating a rustling, crunching soundtrack to anyone moving through them. Hunters were out in force. Deer season was underway, and the Sands Boys Mountains, despite their dark reputation after the Jamison disappearance, remained popular with outdoorsmen. On November 16th, a group of hunters was traversing a remote area of the mountains, several miles from any road or trail. This was deep wilderness, the kind of place humans rarely ventured. The terrain was rough, rocky, covered in dense vegetation, challenging to navigate. One of the hunters noticed something that didn't belong. Among the leaf litter and natural debris, there was a shape that seemed wrong, out of place. At first, he thought it might be the remains of a deer or other large animal. But as he approached for a closer look, he realized with dawning horror that he was looking at human bones. The hunter immediately contacted authorities. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found themselves in an area approximately 7 miles from where the Jamison truck had been abandoned 4 years earlier. The location was northwest of the truck's position, deeper into the wilderness, in terrain that was extremely difficult to access. There, lying in close proximity to each other, were 3 sets of human remains. The bodies had been there for years, exposed to the elements, to wildlife, to the slow processes of decomposition. They were mostly skeletal, with little soft tissue remaining. The bones were scattered somewhat. Animals had been at them. But the 3 sets of remains were clearly clustered together, suggesting the 3 individuals had died in the same general location. There was no clothing immediately visible, no obvious personal effects. The forest had reclaimed this area, covering the remains with layers of leaves and vegetation. If the hunters hadn't been walking precisely where they were, If they hadn't happened to notice that one shape that didn't quite fit, the remains might have lain undiscovered for many more years, or forever. The discovery site was immediately secured. A forensic team was called in. The area was photographed, measured, and documented with meticulous care. Each bone, each fragment, each piece of potential evidence was catalogued and collected. The location itself was telling. This was not near any trail or path. To reach this spot from the road where the truck had been found would require walking through extremely challenging terrain. Up steep slopes, through dense forest, over rocky ground. It wasn't impossible, but it would have been a difficult journey, especially for people who weren't experienced hikers. Why had the Jamisons come to this remote location? Had they been brought here by force? Had they wandered here in a state of confusion or panic? Had they been trying to hide from something or someone? The position of the remains suggested the three individuals had died relatively close together in time and space. There was no evidence of the bodies having been moved post-mortem. They appeared to have been lying in this spot since death occurred. But how had they died? That was the critical question that would require forensic analysis to answer. Of course, investigators strongly suspected these were the remains of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The location, the number of bodies, the timing all pointed to the missing family. But suspicion needed to be confirmed through scientific analysis. The remains were transported to the Oklahoma office of the chief medical examiner in Oklahoma City. There, forensic anthropologists began the painstaking process of examination and identification. Determining identity from skeletal remains relies on several methods. Dental records. If dental records are available for comparison, matching dental work, fillings, crowns, unique tooth patterns, can provide definitive identification. The Jamison family's dental records were obtained and compared to the remains. DNA analysis samples from the bones could be analyzed and compared to DNA from known relatives of the Jamisons. This process takes time but provides extremely reliable results. Anthropological assessment. By examining the bones themselves, forensic anthropologists can determine approximate age, sex, height, and sometimes identify specific unique features that might match medical records. The examination revealed remains set 1 adult male, consistent with Bobby Jamison's age, height, and known characteristics. Dental records provided a strong match. Remain set 20 adult female, consistent with Sherilyn Jamison's age, height, and known characteristics. Dental records again provided corroborating evidence. Remain set 3 child, approximately 6 years old, consistent with Madison Jamison's age and size. DNA analysis confirmed what the dental records suggested. These were indeed the remains of Bobby Dale Jamison, Sherilyn Lane Jamison, and Madison Stormy Star Jamison. 4 years after they had disappeared into the Sans Bois Mountains, the family had been found. But the discovery, while providing one answer, raised a host of new questions. The medical examiner's office conducted a thorough examination of the remains, attempting to determine cause and manner of death. This was an enormous challenge. The bodies had been exposed to the elements for 4 years. Much of the soft tissue was gone. The bones had been affected by weather, insects, and animal activity. The forensic team looked for any evidence of trauma that would be visible on bone. Gunshot wounds, bullets can leave characteristic marks on bones. Entry and exit holes, fracture patterns. Metallic. The examination looked carefully for any such evidence. Blunt force trauma. Heavy impacts can fracture or break bones in ways that are identifiable even years later. Skull fractures, broken ribs, damaged vertebrae, all would suggest violent trauma. Sharp force trauma, knife wounds, or other cutting injuries can leave marks on bones, particularly if the blade struck bone during the attack. Strangulation. While the soft tissue needed for identifying most strangulation deaths was long gone, sometimes very forceful strangulation can damage the hyoid bone in the neck, a small horseshoe-shaped bone that can retain evidence of this trauma. The examination was exhaustive, employing the latest forensic techniques and technology. The bones were X-rayed, examined under microscopes, analyzed for any trace evidence, and the conclusion: there was no definitive evidence of how the Jamisons had died. No bullet holes. No fracture patterns consistent with violent trauma. No damage that would conclusively indicate murder, suicide, or accidental death. The remains simply didn't tell the story of how these three people had died. In December 2013, the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office issued its official findings. The remains were confirmed to be those of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. But the cause of death was listed as undetermined, and the manner of death was also listed as undetermined. This was not the answer anyone wanted, but it was the honest scientific conclusion. Without soft tissue, without a crime scene that had been preserved, without witnesses, it was simply impossible to determine definitively what had killed this family. The medical examiner noted that the lack of obvious trauma didn't necessarily rule out homicide. Many methods of killing, certain types of gunshot wounds, poisoning, suffocation, might not leave marks on bone. A bullet that passed through, a lethal dose of drugs, being forced to ingest poison. Any of these could kill without leaving skeletal evidence. Similarly, the findings didn't rule out suicide or accident. Exposure to the elements, dehydration, hypothermia. These natural causes of death leave no marks on bones. The investigation was back to square one in some ways. They had found the bodies, confirmed their identities, but were no closer to understanding what had happened in those mountains 4 years earlier. While the bones couldn't tell investigators how the Jamisons died, the scene where they were found provided some clues. Distance from the truck, the remains were 7 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. This was a significant distance to cover in rough terrain. It suggested the family had either been forced to walk this far, or had chosen to for reasons unknown. Positioning. The 3 sets of remains were found close together, within a small area. This suggested the family had died at approximately the same time and in the same location. If they had died of exposure while lost and wandering, you might expect the bodies to be more spread out as they succumbed at different rates. The clustering suggested a single event rather than a gradual dying off. No personal effects despite careful searching of the area around the remains. Investigators found almost no personal effects. No wallets, no jewelry, no clothing remnants beyond small fragments, no shoes. This was unusual. Even after years of exposure, you would typically expect to find more material evidence. Metal objects like belt buckles, synthetic fabrics that resist decay, rubber-soled shoes. The absence of these items raised questions. Had the family been stripped of their belongings before death? Had scavengers dragged items away? Or had the 4 years of exposure simply destroyed everything? No weapons, no gun was found near the bodies. This was significant because it reduced the likelihood of a murder, suicide involving a firearm. If Bobby had shot his family and then himself, the gun should have been near his remains. The fact that no weapon was found suggested either the family had been killed by someone else who took the weapon with them, or they had died by some method that didn't involve a gun. Location. The specific spot where the remains were found was extremely remote and difficult to access. Why had the family come here? There was nothing of obvious interest in this location, no structure, no landmark, no feature that would attract people. It seemed like a random spot in the middle of the wilderness. This randomness itself was suspicious. If the family had been murdered, why would the killer choose this specific location? It would have been extremely difficult to force 3 people to walk 7 miles through rough terrain. Wouldn't it have made more sense to kill them near the truck? Unless the killer knew this area extremely well, knew exactly where to go, ensure the bodies would never be found, and had enough control over the family to force them to walk to their own deaths. One critical question that could not be answered: what substances, if any, were in the Jamisons' systems when they died? Under normal circumstances, toxicology testing on deceased individuals can reveal the presence of drugs, alcohol, poisons, and other chemicals. This testing is typically performed on blood, liver tissue, or other soft tissues, but the Jamison remains had no soft tissue. After 4 years of exposure, such testing was impossible. This meant that one entire avenue of investigation, determining whether the family had been drugged, poisoned, or under the influence of any substances, was closed off. Had the bodies been found soon after death, toxicology might have answered many questions. Were Bobby and Sherilyn under the influence of their prescription medications when they died? Had they taken additional drugs? Had they been poisoned? Now, those questions would remain forever unanswered. With the cause of death undetermined, investigators and forensic experts had to grapple with the question of manner of death. In forensic pathology, manner of death is classified into 5 categories: natural death resulting from disease or natural processes, accident, unintentional death, suicide, self-inflicted death, homicide, death at the hands of another person, undetermined, when evidence is insufficient to confidently assign one of the other categories. The medical examiner had chosen undetermined because the evidence could support multiple interpretations. Homicide seemed possible because the family had left significant cash behind, suggesting they didn't leave voluntarily. The remote location where bodies were found seemed like a deliberate choice. All 3 died together, which is unusual for natural or accidental deaths. The strange security footage suggested something abnormal was happening. Suicide seemed possible because both Bobby and Sherilyn had mental health issues and had been under stress. The family had made cryptic comments about not coming back. A murder, suicide would explain why all 3 died together. The remoteness of the location could suggest a desire to hide the act. Accident seemed possible because the family could have become lost or disoriented while exploring. They might have died of exposure if stranded in the wilderness. The lack of trauma on the bones was consistent with environmental death. Each possibility had evidence supporting it, had evidence against it. Without more definitive forensic findings, the manner of death would remain officially undetermined. The discovery of the bodies, while not providing immediate answers, gave the investigation new energy. The case was no longer just a missing persons mystery, it was potentially a triple homicide. Resources were allocated, investigators were assigned, and the evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes. Mr. Beauchamp, the man whose property was near where the truck had been found and who had been helping the Jamisons view land, was re-interviewed. Had his story changed in the intervening 4 years? Did he have any new information to share? Mr. Beauchamp maintained the same account he had given in 2009. He had been expecting to meet the Jamisons on October 8th, but they never showed. He claimed to have no knowledge of what happened to them. He expressed shock and sadness at the discovery of their bodies. Investigators pressed him harder this time. The bodies had been found even deeper in the wilderness, in an area that seemed to require local knowledge to access. Did Mr. Beauchamp know this area? Yes, he admitted. He was familiar with that part of the mountains. He had hunted and explored there over the years. Could he explain why the Jamisons might have gone to that specific location? No, he couldn't. It wasn't on the road to any property they had been looking at. There was nothing there of interest. Detectives were suspicious, but suspicion isn't evidence. They had no physical evidence linking Mr. Beauchamp to the deaths. No witnesses placed him with the Jamisons on October 8th. No forensic evidence connected him to the crime scene. He remained a person of interest. But without more concrete evidence, the investigation couldn't move forward on this front. With the finding of the bodies in such a remote location, the drug-related murder theory gained renewed traction. The scenario went something like this. Bobby had been involved in some kind of drug transaction, either buying medication illegally or perhaps dealing in some way. The $32,000 was connected to this drug activity. On October 8th, Bobby had brought his family to the mountains to complete a drug deal or to meet with people involved in the illegal trade. Something had gone wrong. Perhaps Bobby tried to renegotiate. Perhaps he couldn't pay what he owed. Perhaps he knew too much and was seen as a liability. The drug dealers decided to eliminate the whole family to avoid witnesses. They forced the Jamisons at gunpoint to walk deep into the wilderness, far enough that the bodies would be unlikely to ever be found. Then they killed the family, possibly by shooting them in a way that destroyed only soft tissue, or by some other method that left no skeletal trauma. The dealers took any valuables the family might have had on their persons, but missed or chose not to take the cash hidden in the truck. Perhaps they didn't know about it. Or perhaps they were interrupted before they could thoroughly search the vehicle. This theory had a certain logic to it. It explained the remote location, the lack of trauma, and the family's strange behavior. But it also had significant problems. No evidence of Bobby dealing drugs had ever been found. No witnesses connected the family to any drug dealers. The truck had been parked in a very visible location. If drug dealers wanted to kill the family secretly, why leave the truck where it could be discovered? One of the more sensational theories that emerged involved cult activity. This theory was based largely on speculation and a few ambiguous pieces of evidence. Sherilyn's intense religious interest and her claims about spiritual warfare, the strange, ritualistic seeming behavior on the security footage, the remoteness of the death location, possibly a sacrificial site, rumors of cult activity in rural Oklahoma. According to this theory, the Jamisons had somehow become involved with a dangerous religious cult. The cult had either convinced the family to participate in a ritual that resulted in their deaths, or targeted the family for refusing to join or for trying to leave. The theory suggested that the family's walk into the wilderness was part of a ritual, and that they had been killed as part of cult practices. This theory was popular in certain online forums and among conspiracy theorists, but law enforcement found almost no credible evidence to support it. There was no evidence the Jamisons were involved with any cult. The ritualistic behavior on the security footage could be explained by many other factors. And while cults have certainly been involved in crimes, the suggestion that a cult operating in rural Oklahoma had committed a triple murder without leaving any other trace seemed far-fetched. Still, the theory persisted, particularly among those who felt that the mundane explanations didn't adequately explain all the strange elements of the case. Another theory suggested that a serial killer operating in the region had targeted the Jamisons. This person, familiar with the wilderness, had encountered the family and decided to kill them, forcing them to walk deep into the mountains where their bodies would never be found. Investigators looked into this possibility. Were there other unsolved murders or disappearances in the area that might suggest a serial offender? Had anyone else vanished in the Sarens Boys Mountains under mysterious circumstances? The research yielded some interesting but ultimately inconclusive findings. There had been other missing persons cases in the region, but none that clearly fit the pattern of a serial killer. No bodies had been found in similar circumstances. No signature or modus operandi emerged that would suggest a single perpetrator. The serial killer theory remained possible but unsupported by strong evidence. A simpler theory suggested basic robbery gone wrong. Someone had learned that the Jamisons had a large amount of cash. This person ambushed them in the mountains, intending to rob them. When the family resisted, or for some other reason, the robber killed them. But this theory struggled to explain why the cash was left in the truck. A robber who killed for money would surely take the money, unless the robber simply didn't find it. But $32,000 scattered throughout a truck would be hard to miss during even a cursory search. In early 2014, several months after the discovery of the bodies, a witness came forward with information that initially seemed significant. This person claimed to have been in the Sands Boytons on October 8, 2009, and to have seen the Jamison family. According to this witness, the family had been with another person, a man the witness didn't recognize. This was potentially explosive information if true. It meant someone else had been with the family shortly before they disappeared, someone who had never been identified. Investigators interviewed the witness extensively. They tried to establish the credibility of this account. When exactly had this sighting occurred? Where precisely in the mountains? What did the unknown man look like? What were the Jamisons doing? As the interview progressed, the witness's account became less convincing. The timeline was vague. The description of the location was imprecise. The details about the unknown man were generic and inconsistent. Investigators came to suspect that this witness was either misremembering, confusing different days or locations, or possibly fabricating the story for attention. The sighting could not be corroborated by any other evidence. The witness account was ultimately deemed unreliable and was not pursued as a serious lead. Another person who came forward after the discovery of the bodies was a neighbor who had lived near the Jamisons in Eufaula. This neighbor reported having seen suspicious activity around the Jamison home in the weeks before the disappearance. According to this neighbor, there had been a vehicle parked near the Jamison house on several occasions, a vehicle that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. The neighbor had noted it because it seemed out of place, and because the person inside appeared to be watching the Jamison home. This information supported the theory that the family had been under surveillance, possibly by someone planning to harm them. But the neighbor's description of the vehicle was vague, maybe a dark sedan, maybe a truck, the neighbor wasn't sure. The person inside had been too far away to describe clearly. Investigators tried to follow up on this lead, but without more specific information, there was little to investigate. They couldn't identify the vehicle or its occupant based on such a vague description given years after the fact. With the discovery of the bodies, investigators returned to the cell phone evidence with renewed focus. The photographs on Sherilyn's phone had provided timestamps and documentation of the family's final hours. But were there other clues hidden in the digital data that had been overlooked? Forensic analysts examined the phones more thoroughly. They looked at text messages from the days and weeks before the disappearance. They analyzed call logs, searching for any unknown numbers or suspicious patterns of communication. What they found was mostly mundane calls to family members, texts about ordinary daily activities, communications with the landowner about viewing properties. But there were a few items of interest. In the week before the disappearance, Bobby had made several calls to numbers that investigators couldn't immediately identify. When these numbers were tracked down, they led to people Bobby had known casually, acquaintances from his work as a mechanic, people he'd done repairs for. None of these contacts seemed suspicious or connected to the disappearance. Sherilyn's text messages in the final days showed increasing stress. She had texted a friend about feeling anxious about not sleeping well, about feeling like something bad was going to happen. These messages supported the theory that Sherilyn had been in a deteriorating mental state, but they didn't point to any specific threat or danger. One text message stood out, sent by Sherilyn on October 7th, the day before the disappearance. She had written to a friend, "I hope this is the last time we have to do this." The friend later told investigators she had assumed Sherilyn meant the last time looking at properties, the last time dealing with the stress of house hunting. But the phrasing was ambiguous enough to allow other interpretations. Was Sherilyn referring to something more sinister? Was she being forced to do something against her will? Or was it simply an expression of frustration with the house hunting process? Without being able to ask Sherilyn directly, the true meaning of the message remained unclear. The security footage that had captured the Jamisons' strange behavior remained one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence. In 2014, investigators had the footage enhanced using more advanced technology than had been available in 2009. The enhanced footage didn't reveal any additional people in the frame. There was no evidence of someone off camera directing the family at gunpoint, as some theories had suggested. But the enhancement did allow for better observation of the family's behavior and body language. Experts who viewed the enhanced footage offered various interpretations. Drug intoxication expert. This expert suggested the family's movements were consistent with severe intoxication from central nervous system depressants. The slow mechanical movements, the lack of coordination, the apparent disconnection from their surroundings, all could indicate heavy sedation or drug influence. Mental health professional. A psychiatrist who viewed the footage suggested the behavior could be consistent with a dissociative state or severe psychotic episode. People experiencing such episodes can appear to be functioning on autopilot, performing actions without full awareness or connection to reality. Body language analyst. This analyst noted that the family members weren't making eye contact with each other or communicating verbally in visible ways. This suggested either they were too to communicate normally, or they were following instructions that prevented normal interaction. Forensic behavioral analyst. This expert couldn't definitively explain the behavior, but noted it was highly unusual and suggested the family was not in their normal state of consciousness or control. The enhanced footage also revealed something that hadn't been clearly visible in the original in several frames. Bobby appeared to be carrying something, though what exactly it was remained unclear due to the angle and quality of the video. Was it something innocent, a water bottle, a tool, or was it something more significant? Investigators tried to match what Bobby was carrying to items found in or around the truck, but the resolution wasn't good enough to make a definitive identification. The letter Sherilyn had written to her pastor, describing spiritual oppression in their home, was re-examined for any clues it might contain. The letter had been written approximately 6 weeks before the family's disappearance. In the letter, Sherilyn described feeling a malevolent presence in their home. She wrote about objects moving, strange noises at night, and a sense of being watched. She asked for the pastor to come and pray over the house, to perform a spiritual cleansing. Investigators looked at this letter through multiple lenses. Literally, could Sherilyn's descriptions of being watched actually refer to a real person stalking the family? Could the presence she felt be someone breaking into their home? Psychologically, did the letter indicate Sherilyn was experiencing paranoid delusions, hallucinations, or other symptoms of severe mental illness? Metaphorically, was Sherilyn describing psychological or emotional distress in spiritual language? Because that's how she understood and processed her experiences. The pastor who received the letter was interviewed again. He stated that he had taken Sherilyn's concerns seriously and had visited the home to pray with her. He described Sherilyn as genuinely frightened but didn't observe anything unusual in the home himself. He characterized her as a deeply religious woman who was under significant stress and interpreted her experiences through a spiritual framework. The pastor also mentioned something he hadn't emphasized in earlier interviews. Sherilyn had specifically mentioned being afraid of someone. Not something supernatural, but someone. She had been vague about who this person was, but she had expressed fear that was going to harm her family. This was new information, or at least newly emphasized information. Who was the Sherilyn feared? Was it Bobby's father with whom there had been conflict? Was it someone else in their lives? Or was this fear a product of Sherilyn's deteriorating mental state rather than a response to a real threat? Investigators tried to identify who Sherilyn might have been afraid of, but couldn't determine a clear answer. The fear seemed real, but its object remained shadowy and undefined. A detailed review of Bobby's medical records revealed the extent of his chronic pain issues and his medication use. Over the several years before the disappearance, Bobby had been prescribed various opioid pain medications including hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, tramadol. The records showed that Bobby had sometimes sought refills earlier than prescribed, suggesting he was using medication faster than intended. There were also gaps where he hadn't refilled prescriptions on time, possibly indicating financial problems or difficulty accessing medications. Some doctors had expressed concerns about Bobby's medication use and had implemented more careful monitoring. One physician had refused to continue prescribing certain medications, concerned about dependence or misuse. This medical history supported the theory that Bobby might have been obtaining pain medication through unofficial channels, either buying pills from dealers or getting prescriptions from multiple doctors. This could explain his contact with unsavory people, and potentially explain the $32,000 if he had been involved in buying or selling medications. However, no concrete evidence of illegal drug activity was ever found. Bobby's behavior with prescriptions was concerning but not necessarily illegal, and no witnesses ever reported seeing him deal drugs or engage in criminal activity related to medications. Sherilyn's medical records documented her bipolar disorder diagnosis and her treatment history. She had been prescribed mood stabilizers and had seen mental health professionals periodically. The records showed that Sherilyn's treatment had been inconsistent. She would take medications for a while, then stop. She would attend therapy appointments, then disappear for months. This pattern is common with bipolar disorder. People often feel they don't need medication when they're doing well, then struggle when symptoms return. In the months before the disappearance, Sherilyn had missed several appointments and hadn't refilled her medications on schedule. This suggested she might not have been taking her prescribed medications consistently in the period leading up to October 8th. A psychiatrist reviewing the records noted that untreated or poorly managed bipolar disorder can lead to severe episodes, including psychotic features in some cases. If Sherilyn had been off her medications and under stress, She could have been vulnerable to a significant mental health crisis. But the psychiatrist also cautioned against assuming this explained everything. Many people with bipolar disorder manage their condition successfully, and having a mental health diagnosis doesn't make someone prone to bizarre behavior or tragic outcomes. The record showed Sherilyn as someone struggling to manage a difficult condition, not as someone inevitably heading toward disaster. Investigators conducted an even more thorough examination of the Jamisons' finances, trying to trace the source of the $32,000 and understand the family's overall financial situation. Bank statements from the months before the disappearance showed the family's combined income was modest. Bobby's irregular work brought in a few $1,000s per month when he was able to work, supplemented by some form of assistance or disability payments. Monthly expenses regularly exceeded income, suggesting the family was in financial stress. There were no large deposits that could count for the cash found in the truck. The family had some debt, credit card balances, medical bills, but nothing catastrophic. The lack of any documented source for the $32,000 remained mystifying. Investigators considered several possibilities. Hidden income. Perhaps Bobby had been doing cash work, repairs, mechanical jobs that he hadn't reported or deposited in bank accounts. Over time, this could accumulate to a significant amount. But $32,000 seemed like too much for this explanation alone. Inheritance or gift. Perhaps the money had come from a relative, given as cash to avoid taxes or as a private family matter. But all known relatives denied giving the Jamisons such a sum. Legal settlement. Perhaps the money was from a legal settlement for Bobby's back injury or some other claim. But no attorney or insurance company could be found that had paid out such a settlement. Illegal activity. Perhaps the money was proceeds from illegal activity, drug sales, theft, fraud. But no evidence of such activity was found. Saved over time. Perhaps the family had been carefully saving cash for years, setting aside money bit by bit. But their financial records suggested they were barely making ends meet, not accumulating substantial savings. The money's origin remained one of the case's most frustrating mysteries. Forensic geographers, experts who analyze crime locations and spatial patterns, were brought in to examine where the truck was found versus where the bodies were discovered. The 7-mile distance between these 2 points, and the specific route one would have to take to get from one to the other, was analyzed in detail. The geographers created models of the terrain, considering elevation changes, vegetation density, natural obstacles, visibility, and line of sight. Based on this analysis, they estimated that walking from the truck's location to where the bodies were found would have taken an experienced hiker in good health 2-3 hours. Average adults unfamiliar with the terrain, a family with a small child, and an adult with back problems 6-8 hours. This timeline was significant. It suggested that getting to the death location would have consumed most or all of the daylight hours on October 8th. If the family had arrived at the truck location around midday, and then walked to where their bodies were found, they would have been traveling during afternoon and possibly into early evening. The route also wasn't direct. To get from point A to point B, you couldn't simply walk in a straight line. The terrain required navigating around obstacles, finding passable routes, making constant decisions about which way to go. This raised the question: how did the family know where to go? If they were being forced to walk at gunpoint by a killer, that killer would have needed knowledge of this wilderness to navigate to such a specific location. If they were walking on their own, what could possibly motivate them to undertake such an arduous journey into increasingly remote terrain? The geographical analysis suggested that the location where the bodies were found had been chosen deliberately, either by the family themselves for reasons unknown, or by someone who knew exactly where they wanted the bodies to end up. Forensic experts also analyzed what would have happened to the bodies over the 4 years they lay in the wilderness. Understanding the decomposition process and wildlife activity could provide clues about the circumstances of death. In the Sans Bois Mountains, a body exposed to the elements would have undergone rapid decomposition, especially during the warm months. Within weeks, soft tissue would have been largely consumed by insects and scavengers. Within months, the remains would be mostly skeletal, The area was home to various scavengers, coyotes, vultures, raccoons, opossums, and others. These animals would have scattered the bones to some degree. Smaller bones, fingers, toes, small facial bones, would likely have been carried away or destroyed. But the experts noted something interesting: the 3 sets of remains had been found in relatively close proximity. They hadn't been scattered widely across the landscape. This suggested either the bodies had been covered or protected somehow, limiting scavenger access. The deaths had occurred relatively recently before discovery. The location was somehow less accessible to scavengers than typical. Something about the death scene had deterred scavengers initially. The lack of personal effects, clothing, shoes, jewelry, was harder to explain. Even after 4 years, you would expect some synthetic materials to survive. The absence suggested either these items had been removed before or after death, or that the bodies had been completely exposed for so long that everything degradable had decomposed entirely. The forensic pathologist assigned to the case faced an enormous challenge: determining cause of death from remains that had been exposed for 4 years. In an interview, the pathologist explained the limitations. When we have a body that's relatively fresh, we can examine organs, test body fluids, look for injuries to soft tissue. We can run toxicology, check for diseases, find evidence of trauma that wouldn't show on bones. But with skeletonized remains that have been in the elements for years, we lose access to most of that information. The pathologist had looked for every possible sign of cause of death. Gunshot wounds to bone, none found. But this didn't rule out gunshots. A bullet through the brain that didn't shots to soft tissue areas would leave no skeletal evidence. Blunt force trauma, no fractures or damage patterns consistent with being beaten or struck with objects. Sharp force trauma, no cut marks or stab wounds visible on bone. But again, a knife attack targeting soft tissue exclusively would leave no evidence on skeleton. Strangulation, the hyoid bones were examined but showed no damage, however. Most strangulations don't fracture the hyoid, so this didn't rule out strangulation. Poisoning, impossible to detect without soft tissue for toxicology. Suffocation, asphyxiation would leave no evidence on bones. We could rule out certain dramatic causes of death, the pathologist explained, like being shot multiple times, being beaten severely, having skulls crushed. But subtle causes of death, or those that affect soft tissue only, were impossible to detect. The pathologist was asked, if you had to speculate, what seems most likely? The answer was cautious. The fact that all 3 died in the same location suggests a single event rather than gradual deaths from exposure. The lack of skeletal trauma suggests either a method of killing that doesn't damage bones, or possibly death from environmental exposure. But I cannot make a definitive determination based on the evidence available. Investigators attempted to reconstruct what the final hours of the Jamison family might have looked like. Timeline: October 8, 2009, 9:00 a.m. Family leaves home in Eufaula, drives toward Sans Bois Mountains. At 1:30 a.m. arrive at property area, captured on security footage displaying strange behavior. 20:30 p.m. Family explores area, takes photographs. Last photo timestamp at approximately 3:00 p.m. 3:40 p.m. Unknown events occur. Begins walk into wilderness. 9:00 p.m. Family travels 7 miles through difficult terrain to remote location. Evening, night, October. Family dies at remote location through unknown means. This timeline was speculative, based on limited evidence, but it represented the best reconstruction investigators could make. The critical unknown was what happened between 3:00 p.m. and whenever the family began their walk into the wilderness. What could have occurred in that window of time to set the tragic events in motion? By 2015, the major theories had crystallized into several main categories. This remained the theory many investigated: the scenario. Someone possibly connected to drug activity, possibly a local criminal, possibly a stranger, encountered the Jamison family on October 8th. This person, for reasons unknown, forced the family to walk into the wilderness and killed them there. Supporting evidence. Remote death location suggests deliberate concealment. Family left behind money and possessions, suggesting they didn't leave willingly. Clustering of bodies suggests a single violent event. Strange behavior on security footage could indicate they were under duress. Problems with this theory. No physical evidence of another person at scene. Why force them to walk 7 miles? Why not kill them near truck? Money left in truck. Robbers don't usually leave cash behind. No weapon found at scene. No witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive. Theory 20. Murder-suicide. This theory suggested that either Bobby or Sherilyn, experiencing a severe mental health crisis, killed the family in a remote location. Supporting evidence. Both parents had documented mental health issues. Family was under significant stress. Remote location could suggest desire to hide the act. Cryptic comments before disappearance about not coming back. All three died together in same location. Problems with this theory. No weapon found at scene. Difficult to explain how murder-suicide would leave no skeletal trauma. Would require walking 7 miles through wilderness first. Why? Out of character for either parent based on family accounts. Strange behavior on security footage doesn't clearly fit this scenario. Theory 30. Shared psychotic episode. Delusion-driven death. This theory suggested both Bobby and Sherilyn experienced a shared psychotic break, possibly delusional beliefs that compelled them to walk into wilderness where they died of exposure. Supporting evidence. Both had mental health issues and may have been off medications. Strange behavior on security footage consistent with altered mental state. Sherilyn's claims about supernatural threats could indicate deteriorating reality contact. Family had been under stress, which can trigger psychotic episodes. Walking into wilderness makes more sense if they believed they were fleeing a threat or following a delusion. Problems with this theory. Shared psychosis is extremely rare. Madison would have resisted or been unable to keep up, yet she was found with parents. Death by exposure usually doesn't result in bodies clustered so closely. Doesn't explain the $32,000. No documented history of psychotic episodes for either parent. Theory 4. Accidental death. This theory suggested the family simply got lost or injured while exploring, dying of exposure in the wilderness. Supporting evidence. Wilderness is dangerous. People do get lost and die of exposure. Lack of skeletal trauma consistent with environmental death. Family was unfamiliar with area and could have become disoriented. Bobby's back problems could have incapacitated him, stranding family. Problems with this theory. Doesn't explain the strange security footage. Doesn't explain why they would walk 7 miles from truck. Doesn't explain the $32,000. Bodies found clustered, suggesting they didn't die gradually while lost. October weather in Oklahoma usually isn't cold enough for rapid fatal exposure. Theory 5. Combination unknown. This theory acknowledged that the truth might be more complex than any single explanation, or might involve factors not yet understood. Perhaps the family had been experiencing mental health issues and encountered a dangerous person. Perhaps they had been drugged or poisoned and wandered into wilderness before dying. Perhaps there were elements to this case that investigators hadn't yet uncovered or couldn't explain with current evidence. This was the most intellectually honest theory, but also the least satisfying. It essentially said, "We don't know," which is frustrating but sometimes accurate. The discovery of the bodies in 2013, followed by the frustrating lack of definitive answers, had a profound impact on the community that had been living with this mystery for 4 years. For many residents, there was a sense of relief mixed with continued sadness. At least the family had been found. At least the waiting and wondering was over. The Jamisons could be buried, could be mourned properly, could be given the dignity of a funeral and closure. But the lack of answers about how they died and why left the community unsettled. Was there a killer among them? Was it safe to go into the Sands Boys Mountains? Could this happen to another family? Parents held their children a little tighter. Hikers were more cautious about exploring remote areas. There was a sense that the wilderness had revealed one of its secrets, but kept the most important truth hidden. In early 2014, after the remains had been released by the medical examiner, the Jamison family was finally laid to rest. The funeral was attended by family members, friends, community members, and some of the investigators who had worked the case. It was a sorrowful occasion, made more painful by the unanswered questions. The pastor who spoke at the service talked about faith, about trusting in God even when we don't understand, about the hope of reunion in the afterlife. For 6-year-old Madison, there was special grief. Her short life had ended in that remote forest, and the community mourned the future she would never have, the schooling, the friendships, the growing up, the life full of possibilities that had been stolen from her. Bobby and Sherilyn were remembered as complicated people who had struggled with health issues and stress, but who had loved their daughter and tried to build a better life. Whatever darkness had found them in those mountains, the people at their funeral chose to remember the light that had existed in their lives. Despite the lack of definitive answers, the investigation remained open. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office made clear that if new evidence emerged, if a witness came forward, if any breakthrough occurred, they would pursue it vigorously. But as 2014 turned to 2015 and 2015 to 2016, no such breakthrough materialized. The case remained frustratingly opaque, resistant to solution to years of effort and countless hours of investigation. The media's continued fascination. The Jamison case continued to attract media attention, particularly in the true crime genre. Documentaries were made, podcasts devoted episodes to the mystery, and online sleuths endlessly debated the evidence. Some of this attention kept the case alive in public consciousness, which could potentially lead to new information. But some of it crossed into exploitation, turning a family's tragedy into entertainment, speculating wildly without regard for the real people who had lived and died. The family members who remained found this media attention to be a double-edged sword. They wanted the case solved, wanted answers, and media coverage could help. But they also wanted their privacy, wanted to grieve without seeing their loved ones' lives picked apart by strangers on the internet. As with many high-profile unsolved cases, psychics and supposed clairvoyants began contacting authorities and family members, claiming to have visions or supernatural knowledge about what happened to the Jamisons. Law enforcement treated these claims with appropriate skepticism. While they would listen politely, no psychic provided information that led to any breakthroughs, or that proved accurate when checked against known facts. Some of these psychics seemed sincere, believing they truly had insights. Others were clearly opportunists seeking attention or money. One particularly unscrupulous individual contacted Sherilyn's mother, claiming to be in contact with Sherilyn's spirit and offering to convey messages for a fee. This cruel exploitation caused additional pain to an already grieving family. Online communities dedicated to solving cold cases focused intense attention on the Jamison mystery. Amateur sleuths pored over every detail of the case, creating elaborate theories and conducting their own investigations. Some of this amateur detective work was thoughtful and well-intentioned. A few internet sleuths even uncovered small pieces of information that professional investigators had missed: old news articles, connections between people, public records that added context. But much of the online speculation was unhelpful or actively harmful. People would identify individuals as potential suspects based on flimsy evidence or pure speculation, then spread these accusations widely online. Innocent people found their names associated with this triple death, their reputations damaged by amateur theorists playing detective from the comfort of their homes. The internet's tendency toward conspiracy thinking also meant that increasingly elaborate and unlikely theories gained traction. The Jamisons were killed by a satanic cult. The Jamisons were government witnesses in a protection program. The Jamisons faked their own deaths. The Jamisons encountered Bigfoot or UFOs. These wild theories obscured rather than illuminated the truth, creating noise that made serious investigation more difficult. As the investigation stretched into 2016-2010 and beyond, the Jamison case settled into a permanent state of unresolved mystery. The case file remained officially open, but with no new evidence emerging and no credible leads to follow. Active investigation had essentially ceased. The detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments, though they never forgot a family that had vanished into the mountains. For those who studied the case, whether professional investigators, journalists, or amateur enthusiasts, certain questions continued to nag. Questions that seemed to hold the key to understanding what had really happened, but that remained stubbornly unanswered. The $32,000 in cash found scattered throughout the truck remained the single most inexplicable piece of physical evidence. In all the years since the discovery, no one had been able to definitively trace the origin of this money. Every legitimate source had been investigated and ruled out. The family's bank accounts didn't show large withdrawals. No inheritance or legal settlement could be documented. No recent sale of property or assets explained the cash. Bobby's work as a mechanic, while providing income, couldn't account for such a substantial sum being accumulated and kept in cash. This left only darker possibilities: illegal activity of some kind, whether drug-related or otherwise. But years of investigation had failed to connect the Jamisons to any criminal enterprise. No witnesses ever came for Bobby or Sherilyn as being involved in illegal dealings. No physical evidence of drug manufacturing or distribution was found. The money sat in evidence storage, a tangible mystery that refused to yield its secrets. The strange, mechanical movements captured on security video haunted everyone who viewed it. In all the years since, no explanation had fully satisfied investigators or explained what they were seeing. Drug intoxication seemed plausible but couldn't be proven. No drugs were found in the truck, and toxicology was impossible on the skeletal remains. A shared psychotic episode was theoretically possible but extraordinarily rare, and didn't match the documented mental health histories of either parent. Being under threat from someone off camera was suggested, but no such person was ever identified, and the behavior didn't quite match what you'd expect from people being threatened at gunpoint. The footage remained a Rorschach test. Everyone saw in it confirmation of their preferred theory, but no theory fully explained what was being observed. The 7-mile distance between the truck and the body suggested deliberate movement toward a specific destination. This wasn't random wandering, it was too far through too difficult terrain to be explained by casual exploration or aimless confusion. If the family was being forced to walk at gunpoint, the killer would have needed intimate knowledge of the wilderness to navigate to such a remote spot. If the family was walking voluntarily, what could possibly motivate such a journey? A fear of a perceived threat, a delusional belief that safety lay deeper in the forest, a planned suicide location. None of these explanations felt complete or satisfying. Question: how did they die? This was, of course, the central question. After years of investigation and forensic analysis, the manner of death remained officially undetermined. The lack of skeletal trauma ruled out certain violent methods, but left many possibilities open. They could have been shot in soft tissue areas. They could have been poisoned. They could have been suffocated. They could have died of exposure to the elements. Without soft tissue for toxicology, without witnesses, without a preserved crime scene, this question might never be answered definitively. For the investigators who had devoted years to this case, the lack of resolution took a psychological toll. Law enforcement officers are trained to solve crimes, to bring closure to families, to see justice done. When a case resists every effort at solution, when the truth remains maddeningly out of reach, it creates a particular kind of professional frustration. Several detectives who worked the Jamison case spoke in later interviews about how it affected them. "You never stop thinking about it," one said. "You'll be doing something completely unrelated, and suddenly you're thinking about that truck, that money, those strange movements on the video. You wonder if there was something you missed, some question you should have asked, some piece of evidence that would have made everything clear." Another detective described the case as the one that got away, not because of any failure of effort or professionalism, but simply because sometimes, despite our best efforts, the truth remains hidden. By the late 2010s, people familiar with the case had generally sorted themselves into camps, based on which theory they found most convincing. The murder camp believed the family had been killed by another person, whether a drug dealer, a local criminal, a serial killer, or someone else. They pointed to the remote death location, the money left behind, and the improbability of the family walking so far into wilderness voluntarily. The mental health camp believed that Bobby or Sherilyn, or both, had experienced a severe psychiatric crisis that led to the family's death. They emphasized the documented mental health issues, the medications, the strange behavior on video, and the reports of increasing paranoia before the disappearance. The accident camp, though smaller, believed the simplest explanation was best. The family had somehow become lost or injured while exploring, dying of causes that left no skeletal evidence. Each camp had passionate advocates who were convinced their interpretation was correct, but without definitive proof, these remained theories rather than conclusions. For those who had loved Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison, the passage of years brought a measure of peace but never full closure. They had buried their family members. They had grieved. They had tried to move forward with their lives. But the unanswered questions lingered. Bobby's father would occasionally contact the sheriff's office, asking if there were any updates, any new leads. Sherilyn's mother did the same. They wanted to know the truth, wanted to understand what had happened in those mountains. "I just want to know," Sherilyn's mother said in a 2018 interview. "Not knowing is worse than almost any answer could be. At least if we knew, we could understand it, process it, find some kind of meaning in it. But this uncertainty just goes on and on." The family members had their own theories about what happened, theories influenced by their personal knowledge of Bobby and Sherilyn. But they also acknowledged they might never know for certain. The truth had died with the Jamisons in that remote forest. As of today, the Jamison family case remains officially unsolved. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office maintains the investigation file, though no active leads are being pursued. The evidence sits in storage: the photographs, the security footage, the $32,000, the personal belongings recovered from the truck. Occasionally, a detective will pull the file and review it, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something previously missed. But the years have yielded no breakthroughs, no confessions, no witnesses coming forward with information that changes the picture. The case has become part of Oklahoma folklore, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a mystery that captures the imagination because it defies our human need for answers and closure. Strip away the theories and speculation, and here is what we know with certainty. On October 8, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison drove into the Sands Boys Mountains to view property. They were captured on security footage behaving strangely. They left their truck, which contained their money, identification, phones, and dog. They walked 27 miles into remote wilderness, and there they died. 4 years later, hunters discovered their remains. Forensic examination could not determine how they died. Everything else, the why, the how, the who, if anyone else was involved, remains unknown. Beyond the mystery, beyond the theories and debates, there is the simple human tragedy of 3 lives ended too soon. Bobby, a man struggling with pain and trying to provide for his family. Sherilyn, a woman seeking peace and safety for those she loved. Madison, a 6-year-old child whose life was just beginning. They deserved better than to die in that remote forest. They deserved to be remembered not just as a mystery but as human beings who lived, loved, hoped, and dreamed. The Jamison case reminds us that not every mystery has a solution, that sometimes the truth remains despite our best efforts to uncover it. We want to believe that every crime can be solved, that justice always prevails, that the truth always comes to light. But sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets. Sometimes 3 people walk into the forest and simply disappear, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered. How could this happen? How could an entire family vanish and die without leaving clear evidence of what befell them? The world struggles to understand this level of mystery, this absence of closure. The case reminds us that evil, or tragedy, or whatever force claimed the Jamisons, can hide in plain sight, can operate in ways we don't fully understand, can leave wounds that never fully heal. The Sands Boys Mountains remain beautiful and haunting, a wilderness that has witnessed countless human stories but reveals few of its secrets. Somewhere in those forests, the truth about what happened to the Jamison family remains hidden, known perhaps only to the trees and the wind and the earth that claimed them. Thank you for listening to this tragic case. If you found this story meaningful, please leave a comment and subscribe. Remember those who are lost and hold your loved ones close. Good night and stay safe.